All right, guys. I'm gonna talk for a little while about this pair of defensive handguns, um, how they work well together, at least in my hands, with my particular preferences and needs. How they work well together and sort of complement each other in various ways, several ways. Both of these are 40s. This is a Car PM40. That's a USP Compact 40. I'll just jump right into it. At the moment, am using the exact same ammo in both of these, despite the fact that this is quite picky when it comes to ammo. Most of that has gone away since I fixed the apparent issue of the factory recoil spring not being strong enough. I put in a stronger aftermarket one from Wolf, and most of my feeding issues went away. However, at the moment, I'm using these. These cavernous 155 grain hollow points for Magtech. These are chronographed out of the PM40 at a muzzle velocity of 1170 feet per second. And out of the USP, they were chronographed at a muzzle velocity of 1210 feet per second. I would say that the recoil, while certainly not mild, in comparison to, say, a 115 grain 9mm out of similar firearms, is not terrible. I don't really mind it. It's definitely got some pop to it, but it doesn't really hurt to fire. It's just the noise in the muzzle blast is basically more distracting than anything else. It doesn't really seem to cause me any great problems. A lot of people don't really care for 40 because of the recoil, but I don't really mind it, and I think that level of firepower easily justifies a moderate increase in recoil. Now, getting into these two guns and what I was saying about why they complement each other. I had this one first and this one afterwards, second, I guess. And what I've discovered is that in order to get this to run reliably, I need to have a vise-like grip, shoot it one-handed, and have my arm locked and elbow locked, and really, you really have to use tension in your arm and you have to have your elbow and wrist locked, and your forearm and hand has to be very tight. You basically have to give the gun something to recoil against. Otherwise, if you just kind of limp-wristed and you're kind of half-hearted in how you're holding it, it's not going to run very well because this requires a pretty stiff spring and the gun doesn't weigh very much. So if you don't have enough force, if you don't have enough resistance to counteract the force of the slide coming back and returning to battery in the proper way, that sort of maintains the correct timing of everything, you will see feeding problems, at least in this individual example of the gun. Maybe it's different for other PM40s, but in my experience with this one, you need to hold it like you're trying to break it, and you need to have your arm locked so that there is a straight line of bone and muscle behind the gun in order to have it run reliably. When you do that, it is 100% reliable with most types of ammo that I've tried. That having been said, why would I like this particular gun? Well, because it's pretty freaking small, especially for a 40. It's quite small, it's quite lightweight. I believe it's right around 18 ounces with an empty magazine, close to 20. It's probably about 20 to 22 ounces with the holster and a loaded mag, which is really not much, frankly. But as I said before, with that ammo and several others, 1,170 feet per second with a 155 grain, 4/10 of an inch wide bullet, that's quite a lot of firepower for such a small gun, and it makes it a viable option to actually go for chest or, upper torso shots on, an attacker, despite the fact that this is a tiny gun. So I have chosen this for my EDC, my sort of standard day-to-day suburban life type carry gun, and I am perfectly comfortable having 6 rounds. It's 5 in the mag, 1 in the chamber, 6 rounds of that ammo. So I've been spending a lot of time with this, shooting it, getting used to shooting it, learning where it impacts in relation to my sight picture, learning how to make it hit where I want it to hit. Off a rest, this gun is extremely accurate. I've gotten right around 2-inch groups at 20 yards on a rest, which is, I think, is remarkable for this small and light of a gun and this, potent of a cartridge. It's pretty incredible to me that you can get roughly 2-inch groups at that distance out of this small of a gun. It's quite nice. However, that does not mean that I can shoot it that well offhand when I'm trying to shoot fairly quickly. The best I can manage at 20 yards offhand is about, I would say, like 8 to 10-inch groups at 20 yards. Probably about 10 inches if I'm shooting, when I'm shooting long strings, 20 round strings where it just, load up a 5-round mag and shoot, 3 to 5 magazines at the same target. About 10-inch groups. It's a nice little gun. I really, really like it. The holster that I have for it is a High Noon. I had this made over the summer. It's a High Noon Hideaway model holster, very deep in terms of like how far it sits below, your belt. The loop is, let's see if we can get this in the camera. The loop is kind of rounded at the top, and my belt, which is also a High Noon belt, sits virtually all the way up at the top in here when I push the gun, push the holster down. So it's hidden very, very well, and it's quite comfortable. A lot of people would think that the thick holster, the thick leather on the holster, why would you want to add that much bulk to such a thin gun, yada, yada, yada. But what they don't seem to realize is that thick leather like this, it increases the radius of all of the corners. So whereas if you were using really thin, tightly molded Kydex, the shape of the gun isn't really that much softer or more rounded than it normally would be. However, when you use leather that's, an 1/8 of an inch or more thick, it really softens all the edges and rounds out all the edges. So it really makes it so that you don't end up with sort of sore spots or hard points digging into you at any particular spot on your body, wherever you happen to be carrying it. I think this is an excellent holster. It's an excellent gun once I figured out how to use it properly. Very happy with this. Now, where does the USP 40, the USP Compact 40 come into the discussion here? Well, I have found that this is well, okay, first of all, it's obviously quite a lot larger, even though this is not necessarily a big gun in general terms. Like, it's slightly shorter than a Glock 19. The grip is about the same length. Height this way is about the same. Muzzle to hammer, I guess. This area here, slide length, you might say, is about, from what I remember, it's about a ½ inch shorter than a Glock 19 or 23 or 32 or whatever you prefer. But it's relative to this, it's quite a bit larger, quite a bit heavier as well, probably 50% heavier. However, that being said, this gun, from what I can tell, is not ammo picky. Does not need to be cleaned and sort of lubricated as often as this does in order to continue to run reliably. And it has I guess it's an advantage in the sense that if I do limp wrist the gun, if my form isn't quite correct, this will still run. I can limp wrist this intentionally and it still fires. However, I thought that might be a problem initially, right? Because I have to be on point when I'm shooting this in order to get it to work correctly, which means that I have to train very deliberately to draw, aim, and fire this in the exact same way every time. And what I was afraid of was that this would be so different that it would confuse me, right? Like I would get, I need to, this is the one that I'm carrying most frequently, although as you can see here, I'm not exactly neglecting the USP for reasons I'll get into in a moment, but I was afraid that because of the very deliberate nature that I'm using this in, that this being a different gun in most respects would perhaps cause problems with cross training, where I would start to be sort of lax on some of the practices that I need to keep up on in order to use this correctly. However, after doing some careful sort of observations, in order to shoot this accurately and quickly, I use the same methodology that I'm using with this. Draw, aim, and fire one-handed, and while I'm doing that, you have a crushing grip and a locked wrist and forearm. And when I do that, I am able to fire with much greater accuracy. Groups are perhaps half or less the size as they would be when I'm using less stringent technique, and I can fire much more quickly. With my crushing grip and arm locked and all that, same technique that I'm using with this, it returns onto target very, very quickly. It's not there's nothing that happens when I'm using this in that way that would make me not want to use that same technique. So it just so happens that what I need to do in order to get this to work properly is something that this gun greatly benefits from. So I'm quite happy with that in the sense that the way that I have to use this is not going to be a problem with this. So I can use these in the same manner so that I don't confuse myself when I'm trying to learn how to use these properly. I can use them the same way, and there's no issue either way. Now, looking at these two guns, you might assume that this one would be easier to fire, more accurately. I have found, now this is probably a function of my hand size. I don't have giant, Brock Lesnar, Shane Carwin type hands, but they are quite long. The bones in my actual hand here are sort of long. My fingers are quite long, so I do I can wrap most of my finger around this. So when I'm in the double action mode, the trigger reach is just a bit short for me, and the grip, while certainly very secure, is not as hand-filling as I would like. So what I have found is that my ability to use this gun at longer ranges is really not that much better than this. So with this, I would be perfectly confident taking like a hostage situation type headshot where you have to hit, a 4-inch circle. I'd be perfectly capable of, or would feel at least, perfectly capable of taking that shot at about 10 yards with this. And this, maybe 12, 15 at the most. So it's really not, though the gun is much larger and heavier and has presumably a better trigger, at least in single action mode, I have not found this gun to be that much more accurate in my hands than this. And shooting it off of a bench and for, just sort of ultimate accuracy testing, trying to take me out of the equation and just see what the gun and ammo is capable of, I have found the bench rest accuracy of both of these to be roughly the same, where I generally get around 2-inch groups at 20 yards, at least with this ammo, this MagTech stuff. So if I can't realistically shoot this that much better than this, somebody, you might ask, why would I even bother having this? Well, one, I would say probably the main one is that the magazine capacity means that I can carry 2 times the ammo that I can with this without having to reload. And this is also a lot easier to get a hold of when my hands are gloved or very cold or wet or otherwise, when I'm otherwise in adverse conditions like that, warm weather, summertime type stuff. This is not a problem at all, even with very sweaty hands. However, in the winter, which I might not have to deal with anymore because I might be moving soon, but in the winter, with gloves, that sort of thing, this is much easier to grab. So and it's, as well as just, I'm not huge on capacity. Like, I'm perfectly comfortable with 6 rounds of that ammo on a day-to-day basis. I think that's more than sufficient for anything that I would ever be likely to get into. However, if I know that I'm going into an area with a much higher crime rate and a much higher potential for somebody to try to do something, with sort of lethal intent to me, or at least as a bare minimum, well, I won't get into any specifics, but if I am in a situation where I feel that my life is in danger, and the odds of that if I'm if I'm in an area where the likelihood of me needing to defend my life is much higher, I will take this over this, just because although this is fine, likely to be fine, it can't hurt to have twice the ammo capacity in a gun that's slightly less technique sensitive. So yeah, this is sort of like the high threat, high chance or higher chance of needing to be used gun. But they're realistically, they're both, I think, close range defensive handguns. I could kill a deer with either one of these with that ammo, and several other types of ammo too, for that matter. But I could kill a deer with either one of these. I could fend off, a black bear or, whatever other crazy, animal wants to, try and take me out. Anything in the lower 48 defensively, I'd be perfectly comfortable handling with either one of these. So it's just interesting how these two work together. The same shooting techniques, that make this run properly, make this run better. I can use the same ammo in both of these and get very good results, I think, in terms of muzzle velocity. And neither one of them are really, this especially, is not a burden to carry at all. This is obviously a bit more. I think this is right around 30 ounces when it's fully loaded, like a 12 rounds in it, holster, all that kind of stuff. It's probably right around 30 ounces. So like I said, about 50% heavier than this. However, it's not that bad. This is a decent holster, and I use it with a 1 3/4 inch belt, and it works quite well. I've figured out how to set the cant on this to the spot that I like. The holster is extremely secure because of the thumb brake. However, it's a very high ride holster, and once I acquire my grip, it's not going to be too smooth on camera, so you'll have to forgive me there. But once I acquire my grip, I mean, it just flies out of the holster. It's a lightning fast draw from the spot that I carry this in. Very fast draw, and it's a very secure holster, so I'm quite happy with this at the moment. It's quite bulky. It doesn't conceal nearly as well as this particular setup does. But I have actually checked with several people. When I go over to their house, and have them come over to my house, I will often have this with me, the USP. And I've asked several people who know that I'm into firearms and who know that I carry firearms on a fairly regular basis. I've asked them after hanging out with them for a couple hours if they even noticed that I was armed. And every single time they go, "What? No, I didn't even." And they're totally caught off guard where they had no idea. Whereas when I look at myself in the mirror, I can tell it's printing very, very badly, but most people just really aren't. They're not looking for a gun on your waist. I mean, just kind of ask yourself. This is sort of just a short tirade, I guess, on printing and all that. Just ask yourself, when was the last time you were out in a public place and you made a habit of looking directly at men's waistlines and checking for bulges in their clothing? Okay, it just doesn't happen. Okay, it's not a natural place for people to look. Okay, it's just, so the whole printing thing and people freaking out about concealability, I really don't think it's anywhere near as big of a deal as a lot of people who are into guns make it out to be. I really don't think it's that big of a deal. However, that being said, what I do think is a big deal is comfort and I guess convenience. So that's why I would prefer this as my daily carry, because it's much smaller, it's much more comfortable, and it's much more convenient to carry. It's less of a burden. On top of the fact that, yes, it is much more easily hidden. I can give a woman a hug while I'm wearing this, and she won't really notice, right? Whereas this, with this, there's absolutely no way. I'm quite slender around the waist. Like 32-inch, pant size waist, and I'm almost fatless, right? Like there's not much to me around my waistline. I don't have a big gut or anything like that. So when this is on me, I cannot hug someone and have them not at least feel it. Maybe they don't know what it is. Maybe they're too sidetracked to stop the conversation and ask. But I'm telling you right now, people notice it if I hug them with this on, whereas they don't with the PM40. They just don't. It's not something that's easily noticed. And I don't mean one of those grandma hugs where you lean in from 2 feet away and like kind of hug. I'm talking like if I'm meeting a chick for dinner, or if I'm meeting a chick at a that I just approached at a store somewhere. and I want to hug her before we leave, just to kind of remind her that, I'm not, I'm not interested in her for a platonic relationship. It's good to give her a hug, like just a nice, warm, confident hug, just to kind of remind her of what's going on here, so she doesn't, have much confusion or ambiguity about what my intentions are. I can do that while I'm wearing this, and it doesn't come into play. Not possible with this. It's just not. It's far too bulky. However, it still has its purposes. As I said, if I know I'm going into a higher risk situation, then I'll pick the USP, because I don't find it that burdensome to carry, but I do find additional comfort in the fact that it's got double the ammo capacity, and it's sort of a go-to-war gun, right? You could be in the worst shithole on planet Earth with this, and it's gonna continue to work. Maybe you have to hose it out with a garden hose or rinse it out under a river if it gets far too dirty, but aside from that, it's gonna keep functioning. This is not in the same league. This needs to be kept clean. It needs to be used with proper technique, and ammo that it functions with. But I don't mind those trade-offs, because what I get on the other end of that, what I get for my diligence and practice and work put into using it, is a very small yet very powerful gun. So I'm fine with this. However, when the shit is really potentially going to hit the fan, I'm picking this, just because it's that go to war firearm for me. So yeah, and then I guess just to wrap up, the effective range of both of these is roughly the same in my hands. So other than that, that sort of go-to-war readiness and the double the ammo capacity, there's really not much difference in terms of shootability for me. So the only missing piece here would be a larger, more long-range suitable handgun. However, I'm not considering that a priority at the moment, because I have a shotgun that I prefer whenever I can have like a folding or a folding. I don't know where that came from. I have a shotgun that I prefer to use if I have the option to have like an actual full-size shoulder-mounted gun. So in the role that a handgun plays for me, which is basically close-range self-defense, 10 yards and in sort of thing, I'm fine with either one of these. I don't need something that I can hit an 8-inch plate with at 50 yards every single time. I just don't need that from a handgun. I just don't. So the way I see it is, these are for 10 yards and in. My shotgun is from 10 to 30 yards, and maybe eventually I'll get a rifle for 30 to 200 yards. I'm not sure. But again, I don't really think that a rifle for me is a priority at the moment, because it's I just don't see the need for me to have a defensive gun if the ranges are 30 yards and beyond. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to be hard to argue in court that you were doing something in a defensive manner when the ranges are that long. So, whereas when things are up close and there's multiple guns involved and shots get exchanged and shit like that, it's close range is much more defensible and much more realistic. At least I think so. So, yeah, I guess I just wanted to go over the similarities between these two and how I think they work very, very well in conjunction with each other. So, if anybody has some, comments or questions, just leave something in the comments section under the video, or get a hold of me on the forums. And I guess, yeah, with that, I'll sign out.